To the casual observer, Marcus Thorne and the rusted hulk of the 1972 Airstream Sovereign were a perfect match. Both were relics, abandoned by time and corroded by a quiet, relentless decay. Marcus, a man whose last dollar had just been exchanged for the privilege of owning this monument to neglect, stood with his shoulders slumped, the desert wind whipping dust around his worn combat boots. Beside him, his German shepherd, Ghost, sat with a preternatural stillness, his gaze fixed on the trailer as if it were not a tomb of rust and mildew, but a treasure chest. For anyone else, this was the end of the line. A broke, haunted veteran clinging to a piece of junk. But Ghost, with an intuition that defied logic, knew that locked within that peeling aluminum shell was a $200 million secret. A truth so profound it could not only heal the man he loved, but could also get him killed. If you believe that the deepest wounds can be healed and that loyalty is a force more powerful than grief, please support us by subscribing to our channel. We are honored to share these stories with you. Let us know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? The silence of the high desert was a hollow thing, a vast emptiness that mirrored the space inside Marcus Thorne's chest. For 2 years since his discharge, he had been running not from any physical enemy, but from the ghost of a single, echoing gunshot on a dusty rooftop in Kandahar. It was the sound that had cleaved his life in two, the sound that had stolen his best friend, David "Davy" Chon, and left Marcus with nothing but a chest full of shrapnel and a soul full of guilt. The guilt was the heavier burden. It was a constant, low-grade fever that slicked his palms with sweat and turned his dreams into a recurring reel of that final, sun-bleached moment. Davy's easy grin, the glint of light off a distant scope he should have seen, the surprised look in his friend's eyes as the world dissolved into chaos. Now, in a rented room that smelled of stale cigarettes and defeat, the nightmares had become his only steady companions. His other companion, Ghost, was a different matter entirely. The dog was Davy's last gift. "If anything happens to me," Davy had said, grinning over a lukewarm memory, "you take care of my boy." He's smarter than most generals. Marcus had inherited the lanky German shepherd puppy along with a lifetime of regret. In the beginning, he'd barely had the energy to feed him, let alone care for him. But Ghost had refused to let him disintegrate. When Marcus's hand lingered too long on the whiskey bottle, a wet nose would nudge it away. When he'd stare at the wall for hours, a heavy paw would land on his knee, a silent, insistent demand for connection. It was Ghost who forced him out of the suffocating room, pulling him on long, aimless walks through the scrubland, forcing air into lungs that felt permanently constricted. It was during one of these forced marches that the dog's strange behavior began. He'd started pulling, with an unyielding strength, toward a dilapidated corner of a local RV storage lot. Every day, the same ritual. Ghost would plant his feet, whining, his intelligent eyes fixed on one specific wreck among dozens. It was an old Airstream, its once gleaming silver skin now a mottled gray, streaked with rust-colored tears. A for sale sign, faded and peeling, was taped to its shattered front window. Marcus resisted for weeks. It was insane. He was barely holding on, living off the dregs of his disability pay. Buying a derelict trailer was not just impractical. It was a final, pathetic admission of failure. But Ghost was relentless. The dog's insistence felt less like a whim and more like a mission. He would sit before Marcus's door, refusing to move, until Marcus agreed to walk in that one direction. There was a desperate, knowing light in the dog's eyes that Marcus hadn't seen since the day Davy had handed him the leash. Finally, worn down by the dog's certainty and his own apathy, he gave in. He called the number. The owner, an old man with a phlegmy cough, laughed. "Son, you'd be doing me a favor taking that heap of junk off my hands. $100 and it's yours." It was almost every cent Marcus had left. He handed over the crumpled bills, the paper feeling as fragile and thin as his own future. He signed the title with a shaking hand, the act feeling like the punchline to a long, cruel joke. He was now the proud owner of a tin can full of memories that weren't his, a rolling symbol of decay. As he hooked the rust bucket to a borrowed truck, Ghost leaped inside, his tail wagging for the first time in what felt like a year. The dog seemed to know something Marcus didn't. He had followed his dog's inexplicable command, surrendering his last dollar and his last shred of dignity to a piece of scrap metal. He didn't know it yet, but it wasn't an act of surrender. It was the first step toward salvation. The Airstream was worse on the inside. The door groaned open on rusted hinges to reveal a scene of absolute dereliction. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten things. Upholstery on the dinette benches was split open, disgorging yellowed foam like entrails. A fine layer of dust and mouse droppings coated every surface. The once proud wood veneer of the cabinets was peeling and water-stained, and a spiderweb of cracks radiated from a hole in one of the panoramic front windows. To Marcus, it was a perfect physical manifestation of his own interior world, shattered, rotting, and haunted by the ghosts of a better time. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. This was it. Rock bottom. He had traded the last of his money for a tomb. He sank onto the dusty floor, the despair a physical force that threatened to pull him under for good. But then, Ghost was there, licking the salt from his cheeks, his warm, solid presence a tether to the living world. The dog then turned and, with a sense of purpose, walked to the back of the trailer. He began to paw insistently at a warped plank of plywood beneath the dinette seating area. Marcus watched, his curiosity a tiny, flickering ember in the cold darkness of his mind. He spent the first week just cleaning. It was a Herculean task. He ripped out the shredded carpets, the moldy cushions, the rotted curtains. He scrubbed away years of grime, his hands raw, his muscles screaming in protest. Each bucket of black water he poured onto the thirsty desert ground felt like a small act of purification. He was clearing away the decay, not just from the trailer, but from himself. The physical labor was a balm. It was honest. It was real. It tired his body so completely that, for the first time in years, he slept through the night without the familiar terror of the rooftop chasing him into consciousness. He worked with a methodical discipline honed by years in the service. He broke the monumental task of restoration into a series of smaller, manageable missions. Mission 1. Secure the exterior. He patched the roof, meticulously sealing every seam against the elements. He replaced the broken windows, the new panes of plexiglass looking stark and clean against the weathered aluminum. Throughout it all, Ghost was his silent supervisor, his shadow. And every time Marcus took a break, the dog would return to the same spot, the warped floorboard under the dinette, and nudge it with his nose, whining softly. First, Marcus ignored it. It was probably just a mouse nest, another piece of rot to be dealt with later. But the dog's persistence was unnerving. It was the same unwavering focus he'd shown in the storage lot. It was a signal. Finally, one sweltering afternoon, he gave in. "All right, boy, what is it? What's got you so worked up?" He knelt, running his hand over the warped wood. Felt no different from the rest of the floor. He grabbed a crowbar, wedged it into a small gap, and pried. The wood groaned and then splintered, coming away with a sharp crack. Underneath was not the trailer's subfloor, but another, thinner layer of wood. A false bottom. His heart gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. It wasn't despair. It was intrigue. He carefully lifted the second piece of wood. There, nestled in a custom-cut hollow, lay a small, heavy package wrapped in oilskin and tied with wax twine. It was cool to the touch, perfectly preserved. Marcus lifted it out, his hands trembling slightly. Ghost sat back on his haunches, letting out a soft woof as if to say, "See? I told you." Marcus unwrapped the twine and peeled back the stiff, greasy cloth. Inside was a small steel box no bigger than a book. It had no visible keyhole, only a series of interlocking dials and a small, intricate engraving of a compass rose on its lid. Beside it lay a thin, leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with the faded initials EV. He had bought a wreck. He had uncovered a secret. The first clue on a trail he never knew existed had just been placed in his hands, not by chance, but by the unerring instinct of his dog. The process of restoration had officially begun, in more ways than one. The steel box was a puzzle. Marcus recognized the design philosophy immediately. It wasn't a commercial lock. It was bespoke, military-grade, designed not just to be strong but to be a test. The dials weren't numbered. Instead, they were etched with constellations: Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia. His fingers, calloused from sanding and scraping, felt clumsy against the delicate mechanism. For a moment, the old frustration, the familiar precursor to giving up, pricked at him. It would be easier to just smash it open. But then he looked at Ghost, whose steady gaze seemed to hold him accountable. He took a deep breath, the clean, dry air of the desert filling his lungs. This was a problem to be solved, a mission objective. His training, the part of his life he had tried so hard to forget, came flooding back. He wasn't just a grunt. He was a special forces engineer, a specialist in unconventional entry. Davy had always called him the Keymaster. The memory brought a pang of pain, but also a flicker of his old self. He could do this. He set the box on the new, simple wooden table he'd built and opened the journal. The handwriting inside was precise, elegant script. The ink faded from black to a soft brown. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Vance, and the first entry was dated 1968. As Marcus read, the dusty, derelict airstream transformed around him. It ceased to be a simple trailer and became a vessel of history, a mobile safe house for a man living in a world of shadows. Elias Vance was a Cold War operative, a courier for a clandestine branch of the CIA. His journal entries were not personal diaries but meticulous logs, written in a veiled, careful language. He wrote of drop points in Vienna, dead letters in Berlin, and the constant, gnawing paranoia of betrayal. The central theme of his later entries was a final, unsanctioned mission he called Operation Argent. He had been tasked with safeguarding a massive cache of bearer bonds, untraceable currency worth, even then, tens of millions of dollars. The bonds were an emergency fund, meant to finance a network of deep-cover agents in the event of a full-scale conflict. But Elias had come to believe that a traitor high up in the agency, a man he referred to only by the codename Argent, was planning to steal the bonds for personal enrichment. He couldn't trust his superiors. He couldn't trust his handlers. So he went rogue. He hid the bonds and created an intricate trail of clues, a treasure map for his unborn son, should the worst happen. The airstream was his rolling command center, the place where he had engineered the puzzles to protect his legacy. The journal provided clues to the box, hidden in anecdotes and observations. A passage about navigating by the stars on a mission in the Sahara gave Marcus the sequence for the constellation dials. A memory of his father, a watchmaker, described the precise number of counter-rotations needed. It was a conversation across time, a puzzle maker speaking to a puzzle solver. Marcus worked for 2 days straight, the world outside the airstream fading away. There was only the quiet focus, the clicks of the tumblers, the scent of old paper and leather. The noise in his head, the gunshots, the guilt was silenced by the focused intellectual challenge. Finally, with a soft, satisfying snick, the last tumbler fell into place. The lid of the box sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were 3 items. A small stack of black and white photographs, a single, heavy brass challenge coin, and a thin envelope containing a small, hand-drawn map with a set of coded coordinates. The photographs showed a young Elias with his wife, smiling, full of a hope that his journal entries lacked. One photo showed him standing proudly next to the very same airstream, gleaming and new. The challenge coin was unique, bearing the same compass rose as the box, but on the reverse, an inscription: Ad astra per aspera, through hardship to the stars. The mission was no longer just about restoring a trailer. It had become something more. It was about honoring the legacy of a man he'd never met. It was about seeing a mission through to its end. For the first time since he'd lost Davy, Marcus Thorne had a purpose. He had a map, and he had a key. The discovery imbued Marcus's work with a new gravity. Every plank of wood he cut, every wire he ran, felt like an act of preservation, a way of honoring the ghost of Elias Vance. The restoration of the Airstream became his obsession, but it was a healthy one, a creative one. He found a local sawmill and learned to distinguish the grain of oak from that of maple. He spent hours on the internet, studying vintage Airstream forums, learning the lost arts of aluminum polishing and buck riveting. The once rotted interior began to transform under his patient, skilled hands. He rebuilt the cabinets with handcrafted dovetail joints, the scent of fresh-cut cedar filling the space. He rewired the entire electrical system, laying it out with the same precision he would have used on a complex explosive device. The work was slow, deliberate, and deeply therapeutic. With each restored piece, a corresponding piece of himself seemed to click back into place. The tremor in his hands steadied. The haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes was slowly replaced by the focused gaze of a craftsman. He was building something not just with wood and metal, but with his own two hands, and in doing so he was rebuilding himself. This new phase of his project inevitably forced him out of his self-imposed isolation. He couldn't find every part he needed online or fabricate it himself. He needed a specific type of axle bearing, a vintage propane regulator. His search led him to a sprawling, chaotic scrapyard on the edge of town run by a grizzled old man named Sal. Sal was a creature of rust and grease, with a personality as abrasive as a wire brush. He looked Marcus up and down, his gaze lingering on the faded military tattoos on his forearms. "What are you working on, soldier?" he'd grunted. When Marcus described the Airstream, Sal's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He'd spent a lifetime watching things fall apart. He respected a man who was putting something back together. Sal became an unlikely ally, a gruff mentor in the world of salvage. He'd point Marcus toward a forgotten pile of aluminum sheeting or a half-buried axle that might have the parts he needed. Ghost, ever the diplomat, sealed the friendship by patiently sitting by Sal's feet as the old man ate his lunch, accepting the occasional piece of beef jerky with quiet dignity. His quest for materials also led him to the town's only hardware store, a bright, well-ordered place that smelled of sawdust and paint. It was run by a woman named Sarah, whose warm smile was a stark contrast to Sal's perpetual scowl. She was patient with his questions, helping him find the right gauge of wire, the perfect varnish. She noticed the changes in him over the weeks. The first time he came in, he barely made eye contact, his voice a low murmur. Now he'd stand a little straighter, ask about her day, even offer a faint, rusty smile when Ghost nudged her hand for a pat. These simple, human interactions were like water on parched ground. They were rebuilding the social connections his trauma had severed. He wasn't just a broken soldier anymore. He was the guy restoring the old Airstream, the man with the smart dog. His world, which had shrunk to the size of a single dark room, was slowly, carefully expanding. The Airstream was becoming beautiful, its polished skin reflecting the vast blue sky. It was starting to look like a home. But as the light returned to Marcus's life, it began to attract shadows. One afternoon, as Marcus was polishing a newly installed window frame, the crunch of expensive tires on the gravel road broke the desert silence. A sleek, black sedan, the kind that looks out of place anywhere but a corporate headquarters, pulled to a stop. A man in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, stepped out. He moved with an air of effortless ownership, as if the entire desert was merely an inconvenient part of his portfolio. He surveyed the Airstream, his lips curling into a dismissive smirk. "Quite the project you've got here," he said, his voice smooth and transactional. "Richard Sterling," he extended a hand, which Marcus took reluctantly. Sterling's grip was firm but felt cold, lifeless. Ghost, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, rose to his feet, a low, almost inaudible growl rumbling in his chest. "I'm a developer," Sterling continued, ignoring the dog. "My firm, Sterling Global Enterprises, we acquire unique assets."
Vintage vehicles, arquitectural salvaje.
Things with a story. He circled the Airstream, his eyes scanning it with an intensity that made Marcus uneasy. This wasn't the casual interest of a hobbyist. This was professional assessment. "Look, I'll be blunt," Sterling said, stopping in front of Marcus. "This thing is a wreck. but I have a client with a nostalgic attachment to this particular model. I'm authorized to offer you $20,000. Cash. You can walk away from this heap of scrap right now with a nice little nest egg. The offer was a blaring alarm bell in Marcus's head. $20,000 for a trailer he'd bought for $100. It was ludicrous. No one would offer that kind of money unless they knew it was worth infinitely more. His training kicked in, the years of learning to read people, to spot the lie behind the smile. Sterling wasn't a developer. He was a hunter, and he was hunting for whatever was inside this trailer. No, thank you, Marcus said, his voice even. It has sentimental value. Sterling's affable mask flickered. For a fraction of a second, his eyes went cold, hard as chips of ice. It was a look Marcus had seen before, in the eyes of men who saw other human beings not as people but as obstacles. Sentiment is an expensive luxury, Sterling said, the silkiness in his voice now laced with steel. Everything has a price. Think about my offer. I'm a very persistent man. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken threats hanging in the air. As the sedan disappeared in a cloud of dust, Marcus knelt and put his hand on Ghost's head. The dog's fur was bristled, his body tense. You were right, boy, Marcus murmured. We've got company. The quiet, therapeutic world he had built for himself had just been breached. The past, it seemed, wasn't finished with him yet. Richard Sterling's persistence was not the kind that involved friendly follow-up calls. It was the kind that squeezed. A few days after the visit, Marcus drove to the scrapyard to pick up a vintage water heater Sal had set aside for him. Sal met him at the gate, his face grim. Sorry, Marcus. Can't sell you anything more. He wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes. Got a new contract. Exclusive supplier. Some big corporate outfit. My hands are tied the next day. Marcus went to the ATM to pull out some cash for supplies. His card was declined. A call to the bank revealed a bureaucratic nightmare. His account, containing the last of his disability back pay, had been frozen due to a fraud alert that would take weeks to investigate. These were not coincidences. They were tactical moves on a chessboard, designed to isolate him, to cut off his resources, to make his life impossible until he capitulated. Sterling was trying to starve him out. But Marcus was a soldier. He knew how to survive on limited resources. He knew how to improvise, adapt, and overcome. He started bartering his skills, fixing a neighbor's generator in exchange for propane, helping Sal organize his chaotic inventory after hours in return for a few needed parts. He was being pushed, but he refused to break. The escalation came one moonless night. Marcus had gone into town for groceries, leaving Ghost to stand guard. When he returned, he knew instantly that something was wrong. The new lock he'd installed on the Airstream's door was scratched, the metal around it warped. Someone had tried to force it and failed, but they had gotten inside another way. A small side window had been carefully removed and then replaced. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was even disturbed. But the message was brutally clear. I can get to you whenever I want. Your locks are meaningless. Your sanctuary is not safe. Ghost was frantic, whining and pacing, his sense of security violated. The invisible line had been crossed. This was no longer a business transaction. It was a personal invasion. That evening, his phone rang. It was an unlisted number. He answered. I hope I didn't startle your dog, Richard Sterling's voice purred. My associates were just doing a preliminary appraisal. You see, Mr. Thorne, I'm going to get what I came for. That trailer contains a piece of my family's history, a financial instrument my grandfather misplaced long ago. You can give it to me, and I'll give you a check that will solve all your problems. Or you can refuse, and your problems will multiply in ways you can't even imagine. I know who you are. I know what happened to you over there. A man with your history. Accidents happen all the time. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a direct, targeted promise of violence. Sterling wasn't just after the bonds. He was threatening to finish the job that the rooftop in Kandahar had started. The threat galvanized Marcus. The fear was there, a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath it, something else was kindling. a cold, hard rage. Sterling had made a critical mistake. He had personalized it. He had brought the war home. Marcus knew he couldn't fight Sterling on his terms, in the world of money and influence. He had to move the battlefield to his own turf. He had to understand what he was truly protecting. He turned his attention back to the clues from Elias Vance's box. The map and the coded coordinates. The code wasn't a standard military cipher. It was more personal. Rereading the journal, he found a passage where Elias described teaching his wife a book code, using her favorite volume of poetry. It was a long shot, but he found an online archive of the poet's work and began the painstaking process of cross-referencing. After hours of work, the coordinates resolved. They didn't point to a bank or a physical location in the desert. They pointed to a specific file number in a decommissioned military records archive. Using the last favor a contact from his old unit owed him, Marcus gained access to the digitized file. The file name made the air leave his lungs. Operation Broadsword, Kandahar Province. Classified. It was the official report on Davy's final mission. Most of the report was a sea of black, redacted text. It was the official, sanitized version of events. A sniper team, tragically ambushed by a previously unknown insurgent cell. But Davy had taught him to look for ghosts in the machine, for the digital watermarks and metadata that told the real story. Tucked away in the file's revision history, he found a single, unredacted annotation from the initial field report, one that had been scrubbed from the final version. It was a partial transcript of Davy's last transmission, made just moments before the fatal shot. Target is not hostiles. I repeat, target is not hostiles. We have eyes on a Western asset making a handoff. Looks like Argent is cleaning house Argent. The code name from Elias Vance's journal. The traitor he was trying to expose decades ago. A sudden, sickening realization washed over Marcus. This wasn't two separate stories. It was one long one. He dug deeper, cross-referencing the mission's logistics. The private military contractor providing security and transport for that sector was Sterling Global Enterprises. It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. Davy's mission wasn't about hunting insurgents. They had stumbled onto Sterling, or someone working for him, conducting the same kind of illicit business Elias Vance had discovered a generation earlier. Davy wasn't killed by the enemy. He was eliminated by a friendly asset to cover Sterling's tracks. The glint of light Marcus saw wasn't a random sniper. It was an assassin. Richard Sterling hadn't just threatened his future. He was the man who had stolen his past. He was the man who had killed his best friend. The fight for the airstream was no longer about money or history. It was about justice. The revelation transformed Marcus. The grief that had paralyzed him for 2 years crystallized into a diamond-hard purpose. He was no longer a victim haunted by his past. He was a soldier with a mission. The guilt that had told him he should have seen the sniper, should have protected his friend, was replaced by a singular, cold clarity. He hadn't failed. He had been betrayed. And the man responsible was coming for him. There was no running. There was no hiding. There was only the fight. He knew Sterling would not stop until he had the airstream and its contents, and had silenced the last witness to his crimes. Marcus had to assume Sterling would come himself, unwilling to trust minions with a prize of this magnitude. He had to prepare for a final confrontation. His first priority was to find the bonds and, more importantly, whatever final evidence Elias had left. The journal's last pages were a complex riddle, a series of esoteric references to airstream construction and celestial mechanics. It led him not to a hidden compartment inside the trailer, but to one built into its very frame. Following the instructions, he located a specific rivet on the underbelly of the chassis. Using a tool he fashioned himself, he turned it precisely 720 degrees counterclockwise. A section of the aluminum belly pan hinged downward with a whisper of sound, revealing a hermetically sealed compartment. Inside were dozens of waterproof bundles containing the bearer bonds, a fortune that could change a man's life. But tucked beneath them was something far more valuable: Elias Vance's final log. It was a meticulously documented ledger, detailing the Argent conspiracy and tracing the flow of laundered money from covert operations directly into the coffers of the Sterling family's burgeoning corporate empire, starting with Richard Sterling's grandfather. It was the smoking gun, the proof that connected decades of corruption directly to the man who was now hunting him. He had the motive, the means, and the evidence. Now he needed a plan. He wouldn't go to the authorities. Sterling was too powerful, his influence too deep. They would bury the evidence and Marcus with it. No, this had to end here on his terms, in the place he had rebuilt with his own hands. The Airstream, once a symbol of his decay, would become his fortress. The restoration work, once a form of therapy, would become his tactical preparation. His skills, the very ones that had been a source of his trauma, would now be the instruments of his redemption. He spent the next 48 hours turning the campsite into a carefully constructed trap. He rewired the Airstream's new 12-volt battery system to a series of high-intensity strobe lights and sonic alarms, all linked to concealed tripwires. He reinforced the door with a steel bar and replaced the new plexiglass windows with shatter-resistant Lexan. He created hiding spots and channels of movement within the small space. He was no longer a craftsman. He was a combat engineer preparing his defense. He was ready. He sat in the quiet dark of his trailer, the ledger and bonds safely hidden, Ghost at his feet, and waited for the war to come to him. The night arrived with a profound stillness, the desert holding its breath. The only sounds were the hum of the small solar-powered inverter and the soft sigh of Ghost's breathing. Just after 2 a.m., the single security light illuminating the small lot flickered and died. They were here. Marcus moved to his position, his heart a steady, rhythmic drum. He wasn't afraid. He was focused. Through a tiny peephole he drilled. He saw two figures, clad in black, moving with professional silence toward the Airstream. Behind them, a third figure emerged from the shadows. Richard Sterling. They moved with confidence, expecting to find a broken man, an easy target. The first man reached the door and began working on the lock with a pick gun. Marcus let him. When the lock clicked open, the man pushed the door inward, simultaneously stepping on a pressure plate Marcus had concealed under the welcome mat. Instantly, the interior of the Airstream erupted in a blinding, disorienting strobe of white light and a piercing, high-frequency alarm. The two men stumbled back, momentarily deafened and blinded. In that moment of confusion, Marcus moved. He burst out the door, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He used his momentum to disable the first man with a series of precise strikes to his nerve clusters, sending him crumpling to the ground. The second man, recovering his senses, lunged at him with a knife. Marcus parried the blow, redirecting the man's arm and using his own weight against him, slamming him into the side of the trailer. A sharp, calculated blow to the back of the neck, and he too was neutralized. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Brutal, efficient, and non-lethal. Sterling, who had been standing back, watched in stunned disbelief. His face, illuminated by the pulsing strobes, was a mask of fury. "You!" he snarled, pulling a sleek, silver pistol from his suit jacket. "You were supposed to be a broken piece of trash. A ghost. The ghosts are your problem, Sterling," Marcus said, his voice calm and cold. He backed slowly into the Airstream, drawing Sterling after him. "This ends tonight." Sterling followed him in, the pistol held steady. "I should have made sure you died on that rooftop with your friend," he spat, his corporate civility stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "He got what he deserved. He was a nosy little cockroach just like you, sticking his nose in my business. That sniper saved me millions. Your friend was just the cost of doing business." It was the confession Marcus needed. He had a small, concealed digital recorder running. "It's over," Marcus said. "Elias Vance left everything. The ledgers, the accounts. Everything." Sterling's face contorted with rage. "Then I'll just take it from your corpse." He raised the pistol, his aim steady on Marcus's chest. The world seemed to slow down, the moment stretching into an eternity, just like it had in Kandahar. But this time was different. This time he wasn't helpless. With a roar that seemed to shake the very walls of the trailer, A black and tan missile of fur and fury erupted from the shadows under a reinforced dinette bench where Marcus had hidden him. Ghost launched himself through the air. He didn't go for the gun or the arm. With perfect, loyal instinct, he slammed his 85 pounds of solid muscle directly into Sterling's center mass. The impact was like a battering ram. Sterling was thrown off his feet, the pistol firing with a deafening roar, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the handcrafted cedar ceiling. Sterling crashed backward, his head striking the edge of the new steel countertop with a sickening crack. He slid to the floor, unconscious. The gun clattered from his limp hand. The strobes died. The alarm fell silent. In the sudden, ringing silence, Marcus stood, breathing heavily, looking at the man who had haunted his life. And standing over him, a low, protective growl rumbling in his chest, was Ghost, his steadfast guardian, the hero of the hour. The wail of sirens grew from a distant cry to a piercing shriek, a sound of order returning to the chaos. An anonymous tip, made by Marcus from a burner phone an hour earlier, had brought the local sheriff's department to his doorstep. They found a scene that defied easy explanation. A gleaming, restored Airstream, 2 unconscious men in tactical gear bound with zip ties, and Richard Sterling, the powerful CEO, out cold on the floor with a large gash on his head. And in the middle of it all, a calm, quiet veteran and his watchful German shepherd. The digital recorder, along with Elias Vance's ledger, told the rest of the story. The evidence was irrefutable. Sterling's confession, combined with the decades of financial documentation, was enough to unravel his entire criminal empire. The investigation uncovered a web of corruption that stretched from covert foreign operations to the highest levels of corporate finance. The story of the decorated soldier who died in Kandahar was rewritten. Davy Chun was no longer a casualty of war, but a hero who had died trying to expose a traitor. His name was cleared, his honor restored. Marcus, cleared of any wrongdoing, found himself the legal inheritor of the contents of the Airstream. The bearer bonds represented a fortune beyond his wildest dreams, but the money felt tainted, a byproduct of decades of greed and betrayal. He knew what he had to do. He cashed in only a fraction of the bonds, just enough to establish a foundation. He called it the Chun Vance Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting the families of soldiers killed in action and funding innovative PTSD treatment programs for veterans. It was a legacy of honor, built from the ashes of 2 good men whose lives had been stolen by the same dark conspiracy. The rest of the bonds he turned over to the government, letting them become a footnote in the larger Sterling scandal. He didn't want the money. He had found something far more valuable. He had found peace. Weeks later, the Airstream was finally finished. It gleamed in the desert sun, no longer a symbol of decay and loss, but a testament to resilience and rebirth. Every polished rivet, every handcrafted cabinet, every clean, new window was a part of his own story of healing. It was more than a trailer. It was a home, a sanctuary he had built not just with his hands, but with his whole, healing heart. He stood by the open door, the desert breeze carrying the scent of sagebrush. Ghost sat beside him, leaning his weight against Marcus's leg, his silent, steady presence a constant source of strength. The vast, open road stretched out before them, a future of endless possibility. He was no longer running from his past. He had confronted it, he had honored it, and he had finally been set free by it. He reached down and scratched Ghost behind the ears. "What do you say, boy?" he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer feared. "Where to next?" The dog looked up at him, his intelligent eyes full of unwavering love and trust, and gave a happy bark. For Marcus Thorne, the mission was finally complete. This story is a testament to the quiet truth that sometimes the most broken things, whether a rusted trailer or a wounded soul, hold the most profound value. It speaks to the idea that true loyalty, the kind found in the unwavering gaze of a faithful dog, can be a compass that guides us out of our darkest wilderness. Healing is not about erasing the scars of the past, but about finding a way to build a new and purposeful future around them, a future where they become not a source of pain, but a symbol of the strength it took to survive. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story of redemption and loyalty resonated with you, we would be honored if you would let us know in the comments below. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions allow us to continue bringing these stories to light. Please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. In our next story, we'll explore how a forgotten letter found in an old library book led to a family reunion a century in the making. Until then, be well.